Hi, welcome to the Sifu Mimi Chan Show. Thanks for joining the conversation. Stewart Kwoh is a national recognized leader and expert in race relations, Asian American studies, nonprofit organizations and philanthropies, civil rights, and legal services. He co-founded Asian Americans Advancing Justice Los Angeles and the Asian American Education Project. He shares why learning AAPI history in school is so important and about the wonderful curriculum the Asian American Education Project provides for teachers. Stewart was kind enough to share some of the painful memories of working on the case for the murder of Vincent Chin. I could have listened to Stewart school me on AAPI history all day. I urge you to check out the website and learn something new today. I was fascinated to learn that 69 years before Brown versus Board of Education, the Tate versus Hurley case was one of the earliest civil rights decisions against racist policies segregating students based on race. I also learned how the 1965 immigration law changed and corrected historic wrongs stemming from the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. How are we to right the wrongs of the past if we do not learn from our history? Asian American history is American history. I'm grateful to Stewart and Pat Kwoh for the work they are doing at the Asian American Education Project, and I'm hopeful that here in Florida, our teachers will soon be utilizing their resources and including AAPI history in our education curriculum. I'm super excited to announce that our bill, HB 281 and SB 490, has finally been filed. Now we need your support. If you know anyone in Florida, please ask them to sign our petition to stay informed and write their legislators to co-sponsor and vote yes for HB 281 and SB 490. I'm loving these conversations and hope you are too. If you are, please rate my podcast on your platform of choice and share it with others. If you would like to support with a donation to help keep this podcast going, you can become a patron of the show by visiting my website or patreon.com/SifuMimiChan. I would certainly appreciate it. For comments or suggestions, reach out on social media at Sifu Mimi Chan. Now, on with the show. Stewart, it is so wonderful to meet you. Thank you for joining me on my podcast today.
Thank you, Mimi.
Well, I have had the pleasure of emailing with Pat over the last several months because I'm, of course, working on this Florida AAPI history inclusion bill, and she has just been an enormous resource. And I know that two of you are a huge team. So thank you both for the incredible work you do, and also just personally on a personal level, supporting the work that I've been doing.
Well, congratulations. I think the work that you've done is amazing. And I wish you the best of luck in the future because our country needs it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And, we were speaking a little off air, literally today, while this is being recorded, this is October 13th. And of course, this will air a little later, but I literally just an hour ago found out our bill just got filed officially. So I'm really coming off an extraordinary high right now and just super excited and also aware that the real work now begins. But, these past 2 years of the pandemic has really shined a spotlight on the Asian American community and the Asian community as a whole. But, from hate crimes to being the blame for COVID to just a lot of the discrepancies and discrimination that's been systemic. And, as somebody who's worked their entire life serving the AAPI community, working for social justice, I was wondering what positives might have come from this spotlight being centered on the Asian American community at this time.
Well, as you said, Mimi, the Asian American community has received a lot of attention in the last year and a half because of the wave of anti-Asian violence, the Stop API Hate and the Stand Against Hatred and other tracking groups tell me that over 9,000 hate incidents have occurred against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in just the last year and a half. And so people are wondering what to do about it. So there's a number of short-term efforts, like people are doing bystander intervention trainings. They're tracking the cases. They're working to respond to the cases, but also there's some of us who are working on the long-term efforts, long-term strategies to bring about much better education for our youth in particular, so that Asian Americans are not stereotyped and stigmatized. There are instances where students are saying that they have been told by relatives to stay away from Asian Americans because we're spreading the coronavirus.
Yeah.
There's instances where people say we should go back home, even though this is our home. So we we find that the stereotypes, unfortunately, ruled the day for too many Americans. And so we feel if we can get our act together and work with school districts around the country, our goal over the next few years is to reach 1 million American youth of all different ethnicities all across the country, to explain to them and have them grasp our history, our struggles, and our contributions to America, our home. And so that's our goal. What I have found in the last year and a half, even though I've worked as a lawyer for close to 40 years, I've been surprised that across the country, Asian Americans are invisible in the schools. 15 years ago, I was teaching Asian Americans and the law for 35 years at UCLA, one class a year, because I was president of the Asian Americans Advancing Justice. But I noticed that the students didn't really have very strong background in Asian American studies coming into college. So about 15 years ago, I co-wrote a book called Untold Civil Rights Stories, Asian Americans Speak Out for Justice. And then my wife, Pat, who's co-executive director of Asian American Education Project with me, organized 10 teachers, and they wrote 12 lesson plans. And so we distributed that to a few thousand copies to local schools in Los Angeles. Then about 7 years ago, PBS, the affiliate called WIDA, the DC affiliate of PBS, came to see me, and they asked me to help them raise money for their PBS series, Asian Americans, which aired in May 2020. So I did that. I helped them raise about $2.5 million. But then they noticed my book, and then they asked Pat and myself for help to be in charge of the curriculum for the series. And in a moment of weakness, we said yes. And Pat organized 40 teachers from around the country to work on the series and the curriculum. And so by the beginning of this year, she had, and the teachers had written about 36 lesson plans, plus the 12 from before. And then because of the anti-Asian hate, we had our master trainer work on 3 lesson plans on the current wave of hatred. So we had 51 lesson plans at the beginning of this year. We hired Stanford to help us develop a teacher's guide, and then they developed thematic units. So racism, civil rights, identity, immigration, and citizenship. So there were 5 thematic units. You could look at our website at asianamericanedu.org, asianamericanedu.org, and it's laid out in these themes. At the top, you can press the theme, And then on the left-hand side, you could press what grade level you're interested in, what subjects. So each theme, like say racism, may have 10 or more lesson plans based on different historic laws, policies, incidents. And so anyway, we have 51 lesson plans at the beginning of this year. And fortunately, we had negotiated a co-copyright agreement. And so we're able to use the clips from the 2020 PBS series. So each lesson plan has maybe 5 to 10 minutes of a clip with photographs, the film, the interviews. So it's all laid out for teachers. And then we developed activities, lesson plans, plus the overview. And then the teacher's guide helps teachers get through it.
Yes.
So since April 18th, we've trained over 600 teachers from around the country. We'd like to train at least 1,000. And we're working, of course, with Florida and you, but we're also working in Illinois. Our partner affiliate, the Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago, got the Illinois legislature to pass an Asian American ethnic studies bill. And so that was fantastic. And then we're working with Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago to see if we could help them train. Our first wave is about 400 teachers. And we're training teachers in New York, Los Angeles, Inglewood, California. We're planning, like I said, Illinois. We're also planning on Las Vegas. We're working with groups in Oregon, in Georgia. So we're really spread out to help at least 10 cities and states with the trainings. And then, of course, we want the teachers to be able to teach in the schools. So what I found is that Asian Americans are invisible in the school districts. Even in Los Angeles County, the county with the most Asian Americans in the United States, there's no Asian American ethnic studies.
Right. And why do you think that our history is left out?
Well, I think that we're in a survey course. So we get 4 weeks. We're with Blacks, Latinx, and Native Americans, which is fine, except that each of those groups has their own ethnic studies course, plus the survey course. And the survey course for Asian Americans has just 5 or 6 questions. There's no lesson plans. Mm-hmm. So we have suggested to the LAUSD, Los Angeles Unified School District, to modify their survey course and give teachers a choice. And we've bundled our lesson plans into a 4-week session. And so we've given that to the LAUSD, and they're still deliberating on it. Mm-hmm. I think that the reason why Asian Americans are not present in the schools are several reasons. Number one, we don't have champions like you and others who are really pushing to get it in. You know, it takes pushing, it takes promotion, it takes publicity, it takes constant effort. That's number one. Number two, I think the psyche in most of the schools, some of them are just racist. They don't consider Asian Americans as Americans, we're the foreigners, but I think the model minority also hurts us because some school administrators think, oh, Asian Americans are doing fine in school on average. And so why worry about them? Why have a special, they see our history as special. So why have a special history on Asian Americans. They don't see it like we see it. Asian American history is United States history. It's an integral part of United States history. What was the first and only racial group banned from the United States? The Chinese Exclusion Act that was eventually expanded to all Asian groups, so that eventually there was an Asiatic barred zone. Where did the bilingual education come from? It came from Lau versus Nichols in 1971, a Supreme Court case. Who actually fought school segregation in the very early days, 1880s, the Tape family. And so all of these important historical moments are part of United States history. And when you exclude that, then you miss so much. What was the group that was incarcerated for 3 years in an amazingly unconstitutional move to essentially attack an Asian ethnic group, Japanese Americans? And without knowing that, then our country suffers. It suffers because then we could do it again.
Yeah.
We could repeat unfortunate history.
Yes.
And Asian Americans have contributed mightily to the United States as far back as the railroad. Who built the railroad in the West? We contributed mightily and sacrificed for the United States of America. So these are lessons that really should be taught and learned. Otherwise, you see Asian Americans as foreigners or as the model minority or as somebody who doesn't belong, as though we haven't contributed to the strength of the United States of America. So I think that belatedly, what we're trying to do now is so important for the United States. And it's also important because the United States, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement last year, the United States is being tested. Are we truly a multiracial democracy or not? And so Blacks are looking at that question. Asian Americans are looking at that question. Latinos are looking at that question. Native Americans with Indigenous Day just a day ago or two ago are looking at that question. If we fail, then the promise of the United States is on shaky grounds.
Yeah.
And yet we have so much to add as a group of people of color that, in our lesson plans, we showcase a number of instances where people of color banded together. Like, for example, it was the Filipino Americans who united with the Mexican Americans in 1965 to launch the Delano grape strike that led to the United Farm Workers movement. And it was the Filipino workers who started that movement, but they were wise enough to seek unity with the Mexican American workers.
Yeah.
Why did the 1965 immigration law pass? I've studied the congressional record. It's because of the Black-led civil rights movement. That's why it was passed. And so we have so much that we've gained by uniting together. And there's so much that America needs to learn about that unity, that solidarity, that it yields much strength. So that to me is something tremendously important and exciting that American youth can learn about.
Absolutely. And you've touched on so many things that I want to keep going down that path on, because you're just such a wealth of knowledge. I think I could listen to you speak all day. But first I've been to the website, of course, the AsianAmericanEDU.org, and I just feel embarrassed, to be honest, because I feel like the kindergartner lesson, I need to start at the kindergarten lesson, because I unfortunately grew up in the States, and not unfortunately, I mean, I'm fortunate to have grown up in the States, but unfortunately did not learn anything about AAPI history, short of a little bit about the railroads. And sadly, I think someone even like myself, who considers themselves to be an activist, I don't take enough effort to continue that learning, because life gets busy and in the way. And being on your website makes me feel like a student again, but also just shows how much of that history that I'm missing, and for all of the reasons that you listed. And, touching on that model minority myth, perhaps you can expand a little bit about that, because you've really talked about some of the facets, one of which is breaking apart the BIPOC community, people of color, trying to pit them against us, as in elevating us so that they feel that we are not also, having oppression. And like you just pointed out so articulately, so many times, there's been solidarity across Mexican Americans or with Black Americans. And as a civil rights activist yourself, I know that you are very, very strong on building those bridges, and having built bridges across those nationalities, and constantly bringing together that solidarity. And even just as recent as these pandemic crimes, the anti-Asian hate crimes, all we see in the media are African-American perpetrators, right? Like, most of those videos we saw were Black Americans pushing down the senior citizen Asian Americans. And I don't know the statistics now, so don't quote me, but I realized that's not actually the majority, that actually is a false depiction. And so we're constantly still getting these issues. So perhaps you can speak a little about that struggle that's meant to separate the people of color and pit them against each other, historically speaking, and, to what I believe is by white supremacists. But you've kind of touched on that. So I'd love for you to expand.
Well, the model minority myth, the readings I've done showcase the model minority myth starting like in the 1950s, after the incarceration of Japanese Americans. There were some who promoted Asian Americans as the model minority, the super student. And it was done, whether purposely or not, some of it was purposeful, to show that other minorities just need to follow Asian Americans, as though discrimination could disappear, as though oppression could just disappear, and just follow the Asian American lead. And so we were used as a wedge between us and other minorities, because then the government and the society did not need to do anything for the other minorities, or for Asian Americans for that matter, because we had it made. And so, but also, as the model minority myth was instigated across the country, it covered up the reality that Asian Americans are very diverse. So there are poor Asian Americans who really do need help by the government, by society, and they need attention. But the model minority covers that up. So, for example, we're for disaggregating the data so you could understand what is happening to different Asian ethnic groups. But even amongst Chinese, you could look at the census and you could see a very big portion of Chinese Americans who don't have a high school education. But the overall data covers that up. So the model minority hurts Asian Americans, because then our true story does not come out. It's used as a wedge against other minorities. And it creates a false impression in the US public that people could just make it on their own. Asian Americans, as I mentioned earlier, benefited tremendously by the immigration law change in 1965. But for government action, we would have still been discriminated against in immigration. And so, I think that the reality is something different, where you have to dig into what is the real reality of Asian Americans? How do they relate to other ethnic minorities? How do you relate to U.S. society? And Asian Americans sometimes are confused themselves because of these stereotypes. But a lot of, especially young people, are starting to really see how our place in society, that it is a struggle, that we do need to unite with other minorities, that we do have to work with whites to bring about true understanding of our status in American society. And each Asian group, whether it's the bamboo ceiling or whether it's impoverishment, whether it's discrimination, or more recently, the hate crimes and hate incidents, needs to explain this to the larger society. We're 22, 23 million people in America today. And it's incumbent on us to share with America who we are. Mm-hmm. And that's why the educational curriculum project is so important. It is true that it should have happened decades ago. But it is also true that there just wasn't there wasn't the interest, or there was the interest on the part of some people, but it just didn't penetrate our society. Yeah. So we're very excited about, we've gathered about 18 consultants, people like Kate Lee, whom you've worked with.
Yes.
And then my wife, of course, is a co-executive director, Pat. But we have some wonderful teachers who have worked with us. We have lawyers. We have a cross-section of community people who are working to bring about a sense of knowledge to the broad American public. And I would say the bureaucracies in the school districts are very tough to beat. Yeah. What you will find is that the policies are very important. They're very difficult to get. You have a Florida bill now, and that's going to be very important. At the same time, we have to work from the bottom up, so to speak. We have to work with teachers in local schools. We have to work with parents and students in local schools who can put pressure on the administrators to get it done now. What we found is that even in states like California that just passed a bill that mandates ethnic studies as a requirement for graduation from high school, that won't take effect until 2029 to 2030.
Wow.
That's too long. LAUSD has mandated 2023 to 2024. That's more like it. But even with that, in Illinois, it said Asian American Studies needs to be one unit. But what if the one unit is like the survey course that I described, where there's 4 weeks on Asian Americans, but there's no training of the teachers in terms of lesson plans. Mm-hmm. There's only some questions.
Yeah.
to me, that's insufficient. That doesn't tell people about our history. And when we've done trainings of teachers, these are wonderful, committed teachers that we've trained, but most of them have not heard about the majority of our lesson plans. They haven't heard, as you said, about many of the laws and policies that affected Asian Americans. For example, the law that banned Chinese women from joining their husbands in the 1880s. It was the first explicit law against an ethnic group. And so my wife was wondering at different times why she was separated from her father, who had immigrated to the United States earlier for periods of 5 years and 10 years. Why was that separation? It's because of the law. And so that law prohibited Chinese women from joining their husbands. So there's many different laws that we need to learn about so that we don't repeat that again. Japanese Americans, because of the incarceration after 9/11/01, were probably the most vocal ethnic group in the United States that argued against the Islamophobia. Because they saw that what happened to them could happen again.
Yes.
And so those are the tremendous lessons that we can learn from our history.
Absolutely. And I was fortunate actually to have a gentleman who was in a Japanese internment camp on my show, and I learned so much. And you're right. One of the things that was bothering him the most was what he was seeing with Islamophobia and the treatment of the Muslim Americans and immigrations at the border, all of it. So it's just been very jarring. And before I jump to my next question, you had mentioned earlier bamboo ceiling. I was wondering if you could define that for our listeners.
Well, the bamboo ceiling, I just mentioned that because I was talking to a foundation, an Asian American foundation person yesterday, and she was saying how her father ran into the so-called bamboo ceiling, where he worked in a technology firm, but because he was Asian, he ran against discrimination to get promoted because some people don't see Asian Americans as having the leadership potential to work with others, to lead others, to lead larger groups. And so I mentioned the bamboo ceiling because Asian Americans face barriers at different levels of their careers. It's not just impoverished people. It's not just people who are being brutalized through hate incidents, but it's throughout society that we need to challenge different barriers.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I know that I'm going to come up against and have already, when introducing my bill to include AAPI history into the K through 12 curriculum here in Florida, I already get a lot of questions like why we should do this. And doesn't that create more racism and separation? And, we get it with the critical race theory discussion and things like that. Like, what can we share with people to really in simple terms, right? If you're in an elevator conversation, they call it the elevator pitch, right? Like, how can we let people really understand that this doesn't create more division, but in fact, quite the opposite? And I know you've articulated a lot already, but I feel like just selfishly, this is something that's going to keep coming up for me. And when I need to explain to people, hey, this is why this is so important and what it really does.
Well, I think the truth really does set you free. The truth is so important in our society. I was just reading an article about the abuse of children in some of the French Catholic churches.
Oh, yeah.
And you could say, well, that happened decades ago. But they found thousands of cases over the past 60 or 70 years up to the present. So, you have to uncover the truth, because the truth will set you free. If you understand the truth, you avoid the pitfalls of the ugly instances, but you also show the unity of people coming together, of rejecting unfortunate solutions, so-called solutions, of rejecting rounding up people. Then the truth can set you free. It's not something that you are preaching to people. It's not an indoctrination, ideological indoctrination. It's really about the truth. And these are instances in real factual terms about what has happened to Asian Americans and how they have so much cared that they have for the United States, that they have endured problems, but they have come together and built a stronger country. The fact that so many Japanese Americans returned to different communities and built up those communities. The fact that even the early Asian Americans who tried to become citizens and were rejected because they weren't white. Today in America, Asian Americans are about the first or second group trying to become U.S. citizens. So, the truth can set you free. The fact that people still love America, try to build up America, try to correct wrongs is really I think, a beautiful thing that people should appreciate, rather than to say that's going to divide us. I think the truth really can set you free. If a young white American youth doesn't know about the incarceration of Japanese Americans, doesn't know that Asian Americans were banned, literally, practically speaking, for 80 years, they don't know the truth about what has happened in America, and they don't know how those wrongs were corrected. And that is so important. How were those wrongs corrected? Yeah. So how was the 1965 immigration law change correcting what happened before? If you don't know that, you don't know United States history. It's not, you don't know Asian American history. Correct. You don't know United States history. Yeah. And that's so important for us to understand as a people. What have we done? What have we done right? What have we done wrong? That makes us stronger as a people to know that. And I just think that we don't want to get involved in what's the best method or only method to teach students. We want to give teachers a choice in terms of, for example, the lesson plans. I said we have 51 lesson plans. If some teacher could actually go through all of that in a half a year, that would be amazing. But we want to give teachers a choice in terms of what they're teaching. But all of those lesson plans are based on historic fact. And that's the truth. And so that's what we're teaching. That's how we can overcome some of the opposition to Asian American ethnic studies by saying, we're trying to teach the truth and the facts about United States history. And that is something that will make us all stronger and make our country stronger at the same time.
Yeah, that's amazing. And you also co-founded the Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Los Angeles. Can you tell me a little bit about what prompted you to get that started? Because of course, sadly, again, until this pandemic, until a lot of these things have come to light in the last several years, I really hadn't heard a lot about all of these different organizations. And that is one of the only positives to me that has come out of all of this darkness and these challenges has been awareness. And but obviously since the 80s, you've been working on this and saying, hey, everybody, I'm here. Can you tell me a little bit about how that all started and, where you kind of found that passion?
Well, the Asian Americans Advancing Justice started as the Asian Pacific American Legal Center in 1983 in Los Angeles, California. And I started it because I went to UCLA, as I mentioned. I went to UCLA Law School. I noticed that Asian Americans had a rich history and fought very important constitutional battles, and yet in those constitutional battles, for example, against the ban of Chinese and then Asians to immigrate to the United States, or the incarceration of Japanese Americans, there weren't Asian American attorneys who could stand up and fight the civil rights battle, to stand up for our rights, to stand up for the Constitution of the United States. And so I felt that we needed to have an institution, a center that could stand up for the rights of Asian Americans and others. And so, and then in 1983, that was the year that President Ronald Reagan cut the legal service budget by 1/3. So actually, the Asian Americans who needed help, especially if they were language limited in terms of only speaking an Asian language, they had nowhere to turn. And because the legal aids were limiting their cases because of the big cutbacks, there wasn't a center dealing with civil rights. So I talked to people, and so we had ministers, we had activists like now Judy Chu, who's a congresswoman. She joined the board. We had lawyers who understood this history, and we had community leaders who understood that history was one thing, but we were challenged with a number of different problems today. And so they said we should really try to form a organization that could fight that battle, especially in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. And we were joined by groups like in the Bay Area, in New York, that had their own legal groups, the Asian Law Caucus in San Francisco, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund in New York. And so we came together, and then we formed the Asian Pacific American Legal Center in Los Angeles. And then we worked to create unity with the other legal groups in about 1990, because that was through my experience with the Vincent Chin case. Mm-hmm. I was the only out-of-state co-counsel for the mothers group, Lily's group, called the American Citizens for Justice. And so I went to Detroit, helped them out. I identified that we should strive to get a civil rights prosecution in Vincent's case, because I felt the state failed and they sentenced the two killers to home on probation and a $3,000 fine. And so Lily and the group did listen to me, and we fought for a federal hate crimes prosecution, which we did get. Unfortunately, in the appeal, it turned out unsuccessful. But that fight was so important because of Lily's courage. It inspired a whole generation of Asian Americans to become, like myself, a civil rights activist. And that was also in 1983. So our first big case was the Vincent Chin case. And so I visited Lily in 1995 with my family.
Okay.
My wife, Pat, and my two sons. And I realized she left the United States because she couldn't believe that we didn't stand for justice. And I visited her in Guangzhou and Guangzhou, China. Mm-hmm. And she smiled, but I could tell in her eyes she had lost everything. And in 1983, that's what inspired me. I said, we have to build the strongest civil rights group that has ever existed in our communities, because we don't want any other mother to go through what Lily had gone through.
Yeah. And for our listeners, can you kind of give an overview? Because, of course, I'd read a lot now about the Vincent Chin case, and I know Lisa Ling just did this thing on CNN, which was wonderful. But I would love to hear, since you actually worked on so in detail with it and were up close, if you could share any of your insights, and also for our listeners to get a gauge of, if they're not familiar.
Well, Vincent was a 27-year-old draftsman, Chinese restaurant worker. So he was a student and a worker in Detroit, Michigan. And he was 27 years old, about ready to get married. And then he went out on a bachelor's party, and they went to a bar, and two white auto workers thought he was Japanese. At that time, they thought Japan was causing unemployment in Detroit. So they cursed him out. They started a pushing match. They left the bar, or they were told to leave the bar, and then they waited outside for Vincent to come out, and then they chased Vincent with a baseball bat. They actually lost him, and then the two white auto workers went back to the bar, hired somebody for $20 to drive around the neighborhood. And then they found Vincent in front of a McDonald's. And then they snuck up from behind in an alleyway and grabbed him. And one battered his head in with a baseball bat.
Yeah.
And so Lily Chen, his mother, instead of going to his wedding, went to his funeral. And Vincent was the only child. And Lily, the mother, had lost her husband through natural causes about 6 months before Vincent's murder. In Detroit, the estate prosecuted the two killers, and they should have been charged with first-degree murder, but they were charged with second-degree murder. And then in a plea bargain, which is an agreement to settle the case for usually a lesser charge, they settled on a charge of manslaughter. The two killers could have gotten 15 years in prison based on the manslaughter charge. But the judge, first of all, the prosecutor didn't even attend the sentencing hearing, which was terribly upsetting to the family. And then the judge said, oh, these two guys wouldn't do it again. So he sends them to home on probation and a $3,000 fine. Home on probation meant nothing at that time. And so they basically, they never spent a day in jail for killing Vincent.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, that's why I came in. I read an article in the LA Times. This was in 1983. And I just was outraged by the sentence, the what had happened. So I called them up. I didn't know anybody there. Actually, I later found out I knew Helen Zia, who was one of the leaders there. But I called them up and I said, can I help? I have some civil rights experience. And they said, could you come tomorrow? So I asked my board, our board had just formed, Asian Pacific American Legal Center, and we formed as a regional legal group. But I said, could I go to Detroit, Michigan to help out? And they said, by all means, go.
Yeah.
And so I studied the case and I said, we should really go for a federal civil rights charge. And so we petitioned Ronald Reagan, the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, William Bradford Reynolds, and they were a conservative administration. They weren't bringing these cases, but we finally got them to bring the case. Different groups, the OCA, JCL, other people all banded together. Mm-hmm. So we had a great coalition. Blacks joined us, whites joined us, and so we were able to get the charge. But in the first trial, the main culprit who swung the baseball bat was found guilty. He could have gotten 25 years in prison, but there was an appeal. They said this was they shouldn't have allowed some of the testimony. And so there was an appeal, and then a new trial was ordered. And then the trial was moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, where the almost all-white jury didn't understand the racial motivation. In a federal hate crimes trial, you have to prove that there was a racial motivation in the killing, and that the killing was in a public place of accommodation, the street or in front of parking lot, which it was. But they didn't understand the racial motivation. The two killers had called Vincent different Asian racial epithets. But basically, in the second trial, that was all ignored. And so they just saw it as a barroom brawl.
Yeah.
And so, I still think about that case every week. And I think about Lily every week.
Yeah.
But her courage to try to fight justice for her son, like I said, inspired a whole generation of Asian Americans because they knew that justice was not served, that hatred against Asians led to this terrible tragedy. But the court system, the criminal justice system did not produce justice. And so we said we need to dedicate our careers to bring about justice for all, and in particular for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And so that's, I helped to build the Asian Americans Advancing Justice into over 100 staff. It was the largest civil rights organization for Asian Americans, still is. And then we united with the other organizations to form the Asian Americans Advancing Justice in 2013 so that we could be even stronger and be united across the country. So today we have independent affiliates across the country in Georgia, Atlanta, in DC, in Chicago, in San Francisco, and Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. And I attribute it to Lily Chin for her courage in fighting for justice for her son. And so we we have a long memory.
Yes, yes. And I mean, it's just really heartbreaking. And thank you so much for sharing so much of that. And I know it's very, very close to you. It must be frustrating, but at the same time, a little bit inspiring to finally see and hear that story being told, especially being so close to you and more people knowing about it, because we're talking almost 40 years later, right? We're finally learning these histories and how many more of these stories exist. Not exactly the same as Vincent Chin, but how much of this history, like you said, American history that has been untold. And not that it has been untold, but it hasn't been listened to. And I think that that's where things need to change, where people need to listen and learn, and we need to get it out there. And so, absolutely, I've been inspired by you and the work you're doing, and with Pat and everybody that has been so helpful in my endeavors. But that's, like you said, from Lily branches you, branches hundreds and maybe even thousands of other people that are advancing that justice and education. And I think that definitely goes hand in hand. So I know we're coming short on time, but like, is there anything else that you feel people need to hear that maybe is bite sized? Because I think it's overwhelming. I kind of felt a little like you with the, oh, we should write a API bill, and then I said yes. And then I got myself into this whole whirlwind, just like you said, oh, let's do a curriculum. And you said yes. And now you and Pat are leading the charge and have this unbelievable curriculum, which of course I'm grateful for, because when we're drafting the bill, I keep telling them, don't worry. We don't need to worry about curriculum. Someone's done that work for us. And that, of course, is all of you over at the Asian American Education Project. So, but are there things that, people can be doing that doesn't feel so large? Because I feel like people don't want to get involved because they don't have the time. They don't have the resources. It's very overwhelming. But I try to tell people there's little things that everyone can be doing. What advice do you give to people that want to learn more, want to be more involved, but maybe don't even know where to begin?
Well, I would just start with people looking at our website and picking out what are those lessons, what are those stories that are very meaningful for you. Like the Vincent Chin story was very meaningful for me. But as I talked to some of the teachers who we trained, a lot of them had not heard about the Vincent Chin story. So what was a motivation to me is to get them to understand why that was so important to us as a people. Why was that so important for us as a country? And so I want to be able to tell that story so that students of all different backgrounds know why that was so important. Why was that an inspiring case, but a tragic case? And so I think that's where it starts. What was the story that is meaningful for you, or stories? And how do we tell those stories to a broad cross-section of Americans, starting with our youth? That to me is where do you start? Because if you just get all involved in theories and ideologies, and you start losing what's your grounding. The grounding is to tell the stories about what has happened to us as a people in the United States. How have we overcome those hardships? How have we contributed to the country? How do some of the ongoing discrimination affect us, like the wave of anti-Asian violence, like the killings in Atlanta? How do we deal with that? And how do we bring that to the American psyche, Americans' knowledge about what has happened in America, and how do we either build on it or how do we correct it? And that to me is something that is very meaningful for each of us as individuals. It's very meaningful for us because we're telling our story. We're telling our story. We're telling the stories of Lily Chin or people who were incarcerated or Filipinos who were fighting for the rights of farm workers. Those are wonderful, wonderful stories. But sometimes it's tough. Sometimes it shows the hardship and the discrimination, but it also shows the perseverance of Asian Americans. It shows us why we've wanted to become Americans at the same time. So there's something there for us to grab onto and to not let go. For example, I would never let go of the Vincent Chin story. It was such a meaningful part of my history and my knowledge, and I'll never forget it. So it's something that we can share with other Americans, and to me, it's a very meaningful thing to share, and that is why we're doing this project, because there's many stories to share. Some of them, like you said, we all learn about. We might have heard a little bit about it, but when we hear more about it, wow, it's a powerful story. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's something that, so what we're doing is not something just for Asian Americans. It's really for America. It's really part of American history, as part of United States history. And that to me is a project that will last for years, because we're going to have to get into different school districts. We're going to have to get into different legislatures. I look forward to working with you because, of course, you're working at this larger policy level, but we look forward to working with you as you work with groups of teachers, groups of parents and students who really want this history to be told. And we'll work at both levels at the same time so that we can tell those stories to millions of Americans. I thought the million goal was pretty bold, but I talked to somebody just last week. He said, you should look for 100 million Americans to tell those stories to. And so I thought, oh, okay, that's even bolder. So we have to go where nobody has gone before.
That's right. You gotta shoot for the moon. So, and I think that with leaders like yourself and Pat, I think that's definitely in the future. And I, again, thank you so much for all the work you're doing and just the inspiration. I could keep talking to you all day, but I'm sure we both have things that we have to keep going with. Perhaps you'll come back and share with our audience some of those other stories that maybe you learned along the way that you didn't know about, because I'm sure in doing this project, you've discovered so many things that have been just these untold stories, unheard stories. And I want to hear about all of them. And so perhaps you'd be kind enough to come back again and talk to me about those. Anytime.
And let's work together
Absolutely.
in a continuing way so that Asian Americans are not invisible, so that we are part of the fabric of America, and we have the history to show that we are part of that fabric of American history and American culture.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Stewart.
Thank you, Mimi.
We'll talk again soon.
Okay. Thank you.
That's all for today's episode. Thanks for listening to The Sifu Mimi Chan Show. Please subscribe and rate my podcast on your platform of choice and leave a review. You can become a patron of the show at patreon.com/SifuMimiChan to help keep this podcast going. Follow me and interact on social media at Sifu Mimi Chan on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook.